June 1st, 2023, day one of the Atlantic hurricane season, and Mother Nature knew it.
The first day of the Atlantic hurricane season was yesterday, and like clockwork, yesterday, Tropical Depression 2 developed in the Gulf of Mexico.
We may not look back at this past season as a highly active one, but there were certainly moments that stood out.
Hillary is now a powerful Category 4 storm with winds of 145 miles an hour.
Storms that made history.
This is the most intense hurricane to hit the Big Bend area of Florida since the late 1800s, so it goes way back.
And moments that caught us off guard.
Parts of Acapulco are in ruins after Hurricane Otis slammed into the Mexican city.
That building is completely destroyed.
And with the new hurricane season came a new leader in the National Hurricane Center.
Even if it's an otherwise quiet season, there can still be impactful storms, there can still be major hurricane landfalls.
Today, I'm going off the radar to look back at the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season with Dr. Mike Brennan, the director of the National Hurricane Center. We'll talk about the noteworthy storms of the year, the new forecasting and communication tools being used, and the successes and struggles of the past 6 months. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Dr. Mike Brennan, thanks so much for joining us today. This is a great honor. And we spoke back in May, kind of before the season got started. So it's great to get back together and kind of recap how things went over the past few months. And it's hard to believe it's already almost over, end of November here. So let's look back at the season. I think the big standout for everyone, obviously, is Idalia, because that was the big one that made landfall. But there was a lot of other stuff kind of churning offshore this year, right?
Yeah, it was actually a really busy season. We got 20 named storms, 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes. But for the United States, at least, it was somewhat quieter. I mean, we did have a major hurricane landfall with Idalia. We had Harold make landfall in Texas. Ophelia had impacts on the East Coast as a tropical storm that made landfall in North Carolina. We had Lee affect New England and Atlantic Canada. But the rest of the majority of the activity, at least other than those storms, was a little farther east this year. We didn't have much in the Caribbean. We didn't have much in the Gulf other than Harold and Idalia. So that's been a big change from what we've seen the last several years, with multiple Gulf Coast hurricane landfalls. But again, we had a lot of systems that developed farther east in the Atlantic and then recurved. And we also had a lot of systems that sort of struggled intensity-wise this year, with 20 named storms and only 7 becoming hurricanes. That means we had 13 systems that never got to hurricane strength, which is a little smaller than the usual proportion you'd expect. But it was also a busy season in the Pacific, too. We had Hillary impacting Southern California, very, very heavy rainfall at a time of the year when you don't have any rainfall typically in Southern California, 5 to 10 inches of rain in some places, a very impactful storm there. Then multiple hurricane landfalls in Mexico, especially later in the season with Lydia and Otis. So busy year all around.
Yeah, and maybe it's me just being an East Coaster, but this seems new and unusual, these Pacific storms making landfall. Is that noteworthy of this year as well?
Well, I think it was noteworthy that we had a sort of a cluster of them late in the season. They tend to be early and late in the season to make landfall in Mexico. Sort of the middle of the season, the storms tend to move more west-northwest to the south of the big subtropical ridge. But early and late in the season, the storms tend to recurve more, if they form farther east and can impact Mexico. But certainly Lydia and Otis were 2 of the 4 or 5 strongest hurricanes to ever make landfall in Mexico, and they happened within the span of just a couple of weeks of each other. So that in itself was quite unusual. Did it have anything to do with El Nino? Well, El Nino tends to make conditions in the East Pacific more favorable. Waters could have been a little warmer, so certainly that could have been a factor. But again, we've seen that's a breeding ground for pretty powerful hurricanes. There's a lot of deep, warm water off the west coast of Mexico. So it's a pretty active region, especially as you get into October. That tends to be the pattern, is storms forming farther east near Mexico and potentially affecting them directly there. Gotcha. Okay. So back in May, you were talking about a lot of the new stuff that was coming out this year, some changes for the 2023 season. So I kind of want to go through some of those and see how things went, if they went well, if they went
okay. There are things to learn from each of these. So let's start with the P-Surge model. You were talking a lot about that and the benefit of multiple storms and being able to issue during multiple storms. How did that go this year?
Well, we didn't actually end up needing to use that piece of it in 2023. We didn't have multiple, storms threatening the United States that had the need for storm surge guidance. But it certainly, we did use it a lot during Idalia. And there were benefits beyond just the multiple storm scenarios. It allowed us to start running P-Surge earlier in advance of the system, providing additional real-time storm surge information, especially for a storm like Idalia that is hitting a very vulnerable location in terms of storm surge, maybe one of the most vulnerable there along the Florida Big Bend coast. So it allowed us to get that guidance out there earlier, help refine our forecast. So, we were able to pretty much highlight that area that got the most significant inundation from the very first, storm surge forecast we put out, more than a couple days before landfall. So that was very beneficial. But yeah, it does give us that ability to do multiple storms at once. It also allowed us to expand some of the storm surge products to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands as well.
Can you go back for those who may not understand why that part of Florida, that Big Bend of Florida, is so vulnerable to storm surge?
Yeah, well, the Gulf Coast in general is very vulnerable to surge because it has a very shallow, sloping continental shelf. It allows the water to pile up as it's pushed on land by the winds of the hurricane. But in particular, the concave shape of the Big Bend allows that energy and that water to really pile up into those areas. And it goes very far inland as well, or at least has the potential to go. It's not just like right at the beach or the barrier islands. It can go tens of miles inland away from the Gulf of Mexico, and it can put a lot of people at risk. So it's a very vulnerable location. And again, you don't need a major hurricane in that part of the world to get life-threatening storm surge. It can be a slow-moving, big, even tropical storm can produce 3, 4, 5 feet of inundation. And in Idalia, we saw some areas that had more than 10 feet.
Yeah, and wasn't it still a major hurricane when it got to Georgia?
It wasn't a major hurricane, but it was a hurricane, I think, we'll look at the final best track, but it made landfall as a category 3. Tends to weaken pretty quickly, but we did have hurricane warnings up through parts of North Florida into Georgia. And then, we had impacts along the East Coast as well, all the way up into the Carolinas from wind, storm surge, heavy rainfall. So, yeah, they're not just coastal events, especially those Gulf Coast landfalling storms can end up being really impactful for the Southeast U.S., not just necessarily along the coast, but also areas well inland can get significant impacts from wind and rain as well.
Yeah, I'm in Charleston, South Carolina. I feel like we're always in the cone, no matter where there's a landfall.
East
we're
Coast,
always
Gulf
somewhere.
Coast, right? Yeah, you can get them coming from both directions, and sometimes people underestimate the ones that make landfall on the Gulf Coast. They think, oh, it's over there, but in terms of some of the impacts, especially the inland parts of the Southeast and even mid-Atlantic states, the Gulf Coast storms can be even worse than storms that make landfall along the East Coast.
Okay, so what about this advance notice when it comes to these potential systems? Everybody kind of looks at the blobs on the website, and now it goes out to 7 days, correct, instead of just 5. How's that going as far as accuracy?
I think it went well this year. We haven't done all of our statistics in terms of the reliability of because it's a probabilistic product. So we're giving a formation probability over the next 7 days. But for some storms like Hillary, we were able to identify the potential for Hillary to form more than 7 days in advance. So for storms where we have a lot of confidence, we can put them in the outlook. I think Hillary went into the high category for formation potential 5 days before it formed. So that's an example of how that product can provide additional lead time. It's not always going to be that way, though. The system that became Idalia, we only introduced into the outlook about 3+ days before it formed. So it wasn't as predictable. But for the sort of bigger, kind of classical deep tropical systems, we did have, it seemed like a little more lead time for those this year. We'll look at what the statistics show. But yeah, the outlook got pretty busy. There were times when there were 4, 5, 6 systems in there. When you're covering that broader week-long time frame, you're going to get a lot of systems in there, particularly at the peak of the season.
Yeah, it's always kind of a relief when the whole map is blank.
Right. Yeah, and if we got into early November, I think we got into a situation where we had a blank map for 7 days for the first time in months. So that's the other thing too, is there's going to be more systems in there with a longer time horizon, not just all at once, but as you go sequentially through their formation chances. So that the amount of time you have a blank outlook, or what we call a one-liner, is gone down because we're looking at a longer time horizon for formation.
Right. All the more special. Okay. Now, this is something maybe people didn't even notice this year, but you removed the watch warnings and advisories from that forecast advisory product, correct?
Right.
And I'm guessing that was just kind of something that flew under the radar.
Yeah, it was sort of a historical carryover of how the products were created, but the forecast advisory has now become like a data product. It's where the forecast data sits, and that's where people parse it out of to create graphics and extract information from. But we still have this legacy inclusion of land-based watches and warnings sort of at the top of that product. So we decided to sort of simplify things and take that out of that product and leave it only in the public advisory, which is really meant to be read and for people to pull information out of about watches, warnings, and hazards. But I think this year it did help us get the forecast advisory out sooner, because in some situations we were waiting for last minute watch warning decisions to be made or sort of tweaks. And when that was happening, if it was in both products, we had to wait and send them both at the same time. If it's only in the public advisory, it allows us to get the forecast out a little bit sooner, maybe just a few minutes sooner. But that helps our partners in the media and the emergency managers to get all that information out there to the public faster. So that was one reason why we did that this year.
Every year, it seems like the cone gets a little bit narrower. And if you look back at, like a cone from Hurricane Hugo, it's obvious, that there has been a major change. Has it been adjusted this year?
Well, the cone, yeah, we do it every year based on because the cone size is based on the track forecast errors from the previous 5 years. So we update it every year. So, in 2023, the cone was based on the track forecast errors from 2022 back to 21, 20, 19, 18, 17. And so it did get a little smaller, although the changes were almost in the noise and not really noticeable. And then in 2024, 2017 will drop out, and then we'll add 2023. So it looks like the track forecast errors actually went up a fair bit in 2023. It was a challenging season for forecasting track. So the cone will probably get a little bigger in 2024, which is sort of a change in the previous trend. But, the overall trend for long term is certainly downward in terms of track forecast error. But again, that's why we tell people the cone is just telling you where the center of the storm is likely to go. It's not telling you anything about the hazard. So it's just one sort of piece of information. But it's not the whole story, and that's why we have to have people look at things beyond that and pay especially attention to the watches and warnings.
Yeah, and I noticed you guys have really been pushing the importance of paying attention to the storm surge warning. Is that being kind of the gold standard for this is the worst case scenario? Do you feel that message has gotten across to the public?
I think so. I hope so. We had a major hurricane make landfall in the United States in a very storm surge prone area and had no storm surge fatalities with the Dahlia. So I think that's a success story there. And, I think it's, people will say, well, that wasn't the most populated part of Florida. And that's certainly true. But there are tens of thousands of people that live in the three hardest hit counties, Dixie, Taylor, and Levy, that live in storm surge vulnerable areas. So there were still an effective evacuation. People got out. There were not a large number of post-storm rescues where people had to go in and help people get out of the storm surge evacuation zone after the surge came in. So I think from a hurricane enterprise, from the meteorology to the communication, the emergency management aspect of it, broadcast meteorologist aspect of it, to get that word out, I think it was a pretty effective storm. And we have seen an overall decline in storm surge fatalities over the last few years, despite multiple major hurricane landfalls. So we like to think that some of that is due to the increased messaging and the explicit focus on that storm surge hazard in the storm surge warning.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt that my phone went off crazy. Everybody in Charleston, their phones went off at 5 a.m. that morning with the storm surge warning and scared us all out of bed.
Yeah, and that is one of the benefits of the storm surge warning is it does activate the wireless emergency alert. So it does, it gets to everybody in that region and says, hey, this is something you need to pay attention to. So everybody with a phone or smartphone at least is gonna see that delivered directly to them if they have this turned on.
Yeah, it comes across the same way like a tornado warning would.
Right.
What about the live streams that you guys were doing on YouTube and on social media? How did that go? Are you figuring out the consistency there? I know we were trying to do that too, and it was definitely hard to kind of keep up with.
Yeah, I think they've been pretty successful. They sort of allow us to get out ahead of the messaging for a particular system. I think we've sort of settled into a cadence of typically doing them about once a day, farther out in time from a potential threat. But in some ways, it's just a way to signal to everybody on social media that say, hey, this is something the Hurricane Center wants you to pay attention to. So it's not something we do every day or even for every storm, but for the bigger events where we know people are going to need to take action and pay attention. It's a pretty effective tool, again, because it goes right to people on their phone, and it goes right to their device, and they can set it up to be alerted to this, like, hey, the Hurricane Center's going live now. And then at times we would go to two a day for when we sort of got into that watch warning phase and there was more information to provide to people. So I think it's a way to supplement the information we provide through our more traditional media pool with broadcast television outlets. But again, it's just trying to meet people where they are. But again, the media pool was always sort of more restricted to the watch warning timeframe. And we know now that people need information sooner. And if we're not out there in that space providing that information, then it's going to be filled in by something else. And so we want to make sure that we're getting our voice out there.
Yeah, it's nice that you guys are making a more direct connection with the community, because before it was kind of Hurricane Center, broadcast meteorologists, and then the viewers in the community. So it seems like a much more direct approach.
Yeah, and I think they're complementary. Not everybody watches television, especially now. We've seen big, huge demographic shifts. But there is still a huge contingent of people that do watch local television, especially in hazardous weather, big news scenarios. So we want to be in that space too, but this allows us to get out ahead of it and to be in a slightly different space in terms of how to reach people.
Anything that didn't go well this year? Anything you learned from this year that you'd like to adjust for next year?
Well, there's always challenges. I mentioned we had, track forecasting in 2023 was pretty challenging in the Atlantic. Some of it was largely due, even some of the changes in our statistics were due in large part to just one storm, which was Tropical Storm Philippe, which lasted a long time and was very challenging to forecast. But that storm alone contributed a big chunk of the average track forecast errors for the whole year. So one thing that was different in 2023 is we had a lot of weaker storms. As I mentioned, we had 13 tropical storms that did not go on to become hurricanes. And weaker storms are typically more difficult to predict from a track forecast perspective. And so we had some scenarios with Philippe where there were challenges forecasting the structure of the storm. And in particular, the steering flow was also complicated because we had systems that were moving more up into the mid latitudes and high latitudes where you can have accelerations and recurvature, and you can get bigger track forecast errors than you do with storms that tend to remain in the deep tropics south of the ridge, where the steering flow is a little simpler and the storm motion is not as fast. So there were some challenges there. Intensity wise, we had some successes in forecasting the rapid intensification of Idalia. We were able to predict that about 2 days in advance. Again, getting the details right is hard, but we were able to anticipate that we were going to have a major hurricane landfall on the Florida Gulf Coast. So that was a success. But then you look at Otis, which was a tremendous forecast challenge and almost like a hyper rapid intensification where the storm increased to more than 100 miles an hour within 24 hours. And that's something that just sort of beyond the scope of our ability to predict those kinds of changes. So that's a significant challenge there. I think, again, just trying to get the aircraft data out there and get that into the storm as soon as possible is very beneficial for the model. So we're continuing to try to do that. But again, the messaging focus is always trying to be on the hazards. We're always trying to push people towards not the cone, not the track forecast, not worry about the category, but again, the rainfall, storm surge, wind, and really focus on those hazards because that's what actually kills people.
Yeah, it's funny. You must feel like a broken record saying that. And I feel like every meteorologist says that, but people still love the cone. They still want to see the cone and they want to see it first.
And they're used to it, and I think that's just a legacy to it because, 20 or 30 years ago, the forecasts were not great. And really the only information we could really provide to people was about a track. Where was the storm generally going to go? We couldn't really forecast intensity very well. And because of the challenges with the track and the intensity forecast, it was hard to get specific about the hazards. Because if you don't know where the storm's going to go, it's hard to tell people where the storm surge is going to happen, what the rainfall is going to be, what the winds are going to be. But because those forecasts have improved so much in the last 10 to 20 years, we can really now focus in on the hazards, which is where we want to shift the messaging focus toward. And I think we're making progress. I really do. And part of that goes to communicating the watches and warnings effectively and then pointing people to these hazard-specific products.
Yeah, I like the addition of the storm surge map too, because I feel like people like the cone kind of because it's this really easy to look at map, right?
Yeah.
And watches and warnings maybe are a little bit more confusing. So the storm surge map, I think, is really cool. I think people like to look at that too.
Yeah, that was a new operational product this year, again, to kind of give that sort of high level overview of where the storm surge is going to occur, what inundation is expected in a given area. And that was really, I think, successfully used a lot during Idalia, but even other storms too. We had storm surge up into the mid-Atlantic states and the Northeast during Ophelia. So I think, again, pushing those products out and getting the attention on those is a good thing.
Speaking of communication, we spoke in May about inclusivity of communication and different languages. And I noticed that the Weather Service, National Weather Service, is starting to use AI to translate into Spanish and Chinese. And I'm curious if the Hurricane Center is doing any of that as well. Are you using AI for any sort of translations?
Yeah, we're going to be rolling out essentially Spanish translations of almost all of our tropical cyclone products in 2024. We actually have been testing this out in the background because the AI software is sort of a machine learning technique. So we've been automatically translating the products and then correcting them. And so then the AI learns, okay, this is the word you want to use in this situation. So the translations have gotten good enough that in 2024, we're going to provide them automatically on our website at hurricanes.gov. They're going to go out as traditional text products as well. We actually even used it during Hillary in 2023. We used AI to translate the key messages into Spanish for Hillary's effects in Southern California and Baja California, Mexico, again, because of the large Spanish-speaking population there. We've done some translation, mostly manual by the San Juan Weather Service office of some of our Atlantic products for 20 plus years, but we never had any Spanish language products in the Eastern Pacific, where almost our entire customer base on land speaks Spanish, and there were service gaps in the Atlantic as well. So this will really allow us, from a service equity standpoint, to provide consistent levels of service in multiple languages, and maybe even expand beyond Spanish going forward.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about when we talk about inclusivity and diversity of communication. The Hurricane Center, if you look at pictures of the employees of the Hurricane Center, is not historically diverse. So I'm curious if there's any sort of push to diversify the Hurricane Center itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think if historically, in general, the meteorological community has been very male and very white for a long time. We actually have a pretty diverse staff. If you look beyond it at the Hurricane Center as a whole, we have a lot of female staff. We have a lot of Hispanic or Latino staff. We have the benefit of living in South Florida. We draw a lot of people from the community down here, but a lot of people come from a lot of different places to work here at the Hurricane Center. And, we're always interested in creating a diverse workforce that allows us to speak to the customers that we serve. And we serve everybody across the Atlantic Basin, across the Eastern Pacific Basin, not just in the United States. So it's important that we try to recruit and retain individuals who have the cultural and diverse backgrounds that allow us to communicate effectively with everybody in our area of responsibility. And, we make sure that we try to recruit cast a wide net as possible. We're certainly not where we want to be in terms of diversity, in terms of recruitment and retention, but we are moving in that direction.
Cool. Yeah, there's definitely the core problem of STEM fields in general.
So it goes all the way down to communicating and recruiting, kids. It starts with kids. Yeah. It starts with kids and recruiting them into STEM fields through junior high, high school, into college and universities, and then recruiting them into the workforce and retaining them. And that's it's not just one piece. You have to work the whole system. And we've taken some of our outreach education efforts to historically underrepresented communities. We had the Hurricane Awareness Tour go to Jackson, Mississippi, which is home of HBCU at Jackson State. It was one of the first HBCUs to offer a degree in meteorology. And so we were able to interact with not just the students and the faculty at the university there, but just the overall community in that part of Mississippi. So again, those are the actions that we have to take as a community and as a institution of the Weather Service to try to attract and recruit a more diverse workforce.
Dr. Mike Brennan, thank you so much. How did your first year go? You like it? You good?
Busy.
You're going to stick with the job?
They're all different. Every season is different. Every season provides you new lessons learned. And, as we move toward the end of 2023, I think there's a lot to go back and look at and try to do better next year. But yeah, it's been an interesting few months, and looking forward to an off season, but an off season full of getting ready for 2024 and what that might bring.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday. If you have a weather nerd in your life or someone that may just want to learn more about hurricanes, please share this episode with them. We'd also love you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Let us know what you think of the show. You can also give me ideas for future episodes. Special thanks to Dr. Mike Brennan, Director of the National Hurricane Center, for joining me today. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.